Margaret Kaplan, I would like to take this opportunity of wishing you long life and condolences over the loss of your sister. I know this is the first Yahrzeit, as last year we dedicated after her passing the shir in her merit, and we had been davening for many, many weeks as a group for her recovery, which unfortunately was not meant to be. But hopefully the davening that we did do and the many shirim we dedicated to her refuah will be an aliyah for her neshama. And in addition, the last year's dedication upon her passing and this year's first Yahrzeit shir will also be an aliyah for her neshama. The entire group wishes you long life. Unfortunately, we lost the first few minutes of the recording where the entire group did wanted me to convey, as well as themselves, their sorrow at your loss, and may you only know joy from now on. And the most important thing is, on a very serious note, this Mishnah is dedicated to Ruth Bat Shmuel Rephael, whom we're dedicating the shir to, for the aliyah for her neshama. So take it by Kevin.
Amen. The Mishnah contrasts a person's liability for damage that his ox does with his liability for damage that he himself does. There's a person who is liable for his ox's action but is not liable for his own similar action, and a person who is not liable for his ox's action but is liable for his own similar action. How so? If one's ox humiliated somebody, he is not liable, but he himself humiliated somebody. But if he himself humiliated somebody, he is liable. If one's ox blinded his Canaanite slave's eye or knocked out his tooth, he is not liable. But if he himself blinded his Canaanite slave's eye or knocked out his tooth, he is liable. By contrast, if one's ox wounded his father or his mother, he is liable to pay. But if he himself wounded his father or his mother, he is not liable to pay. But if one's ox set fire to a stack of grain on the Sabbath, he is liable to pay. But if he himself set fire to a stack on the Sabbath, he is not liable to pay, because he is liable to lose his life.
Excellently read.
Now, Damon, the question I want to ask you there, liable to lose his life for all of these things that he did, or only for the last point, set fire to a stack and wound his father or mother?
Only on the last 2 points. If he in Sanhedrin, we learn a whole lot of death penalty cases. Obviously, breaking the Shabbos with warning and intent, and witnesses, etc., and damaging one's father or mother. Okay, and hitting one's father or mother. So those are death penalty offenses. How do you know? If you look at the 10 Commandments. Those 10 Commandments are death penalty offenses. When it talks about kidnapping, for example, theft, it's actually referring to kidnapping. That's a death penalty case. Idol worshipping, death penalty case. Idolatry, you shall not cover thy neighbor's wife. Murder, thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Thou shalt honor one's mother and father. So these 10 Commandments are big ones. So obviously only the last 2. Good question. All right. So what we're seeing here is a contrast of liability between if your property damages compared to if you damage. In certain cases, you're liable if your property damages, but not if you damage. And in other cases, you're liable if you damage, but not if your property damages. So we're going to go through this now. So if you have a look, basically, we initially learned a Gemara in the 26th daf, Aleph, where it brought the scriptural verses that when an ox injures a person, you as the owner are only liable to pay for the bodily damage, right? Nezek shalem. That's all you have to pay is the actual full damages for the body. Obviously, it's if it's an ox that gores, you've got the tam and muad principle, but shein and regel full damages if your property hurts. Now we learned that Rabbi Akiva says that there's no such concept as tam when your ox hurts a human being. The rabbis say there is, but the Rabbi Akiva says there's not. Contrasting it with a human being that injures another human being, you're liable for the 4 additional payments of pain, medical expenses, loss of employment, and humiliation, as well as the bodily damage. That's according to Rashi. So actually, all these differences between a person and an ox have already been enumerated before, and it will be enumerated again in the 87th daf. So basically, we're going to be discussing those particular points of liability. So I want you to have a look, guys. If you look at your ox, do you remember the point if one's ox blinded his Canaanite slave's eye or knocked out his tooth? Do you remember we learned that? He is not liable. Why is he not liable, guys?
If he knocked out, is this his own Canaanite slave?
Yes. In other words, here it's saying, and I just want to clear something up. It says, if your ox blinded, if your property blinded your Canaanite slave or knocked out his tooth, he's not liable. Why? If your ox did it, you're not liable. And if you did it, you're liable, but you're liable to what?
Can I answer for one part of it? Or Gavin first?
Sure.
No, I would have said you're liable just for pain.
Okay. Kevin?
Or damage. Damage,
Can
maybe.
I try to give the reason? I think this may be the reason.
I'm listening.
If it was guarded as best as possible, but it still did it, that's why you're not liable, because there was no negligence in the guarding of this ox that did it.
Okay. No, we're not there yet, but it is actually a valid point. We're going to hit this maybe in a few Gemaras.
So that's why maybe it's he's not liable for his ox damaging.
Okay. You're not liable for a very simple reason, and this is not a politically correct here. If your ox blinded somebody, it's your property, but damaging your property. I hate to think of it like that, but that's actually as it is. Your ox is your property. Your slave is your property. If your property damaged your own property, you're not liable for payment. That's the bottom line.
It's yours.
It's yours.
Yeah, okay. His.
Right. Yeah, in other words,
Canaanite.
I'm saying his. In other words, I have a ox, and it's my property, and it damaged. It damaged my slave. It's both my property colliding with each other, and therefore I'm not liable because I don't have to pay when I damage my own property. So why do we say if a person blinded his Canaanite slave or knocked out his tooth, he's liable? We're not saying liable for payment. He's liable to release his slave, because when that's what you're liable to, for the release of your slave. Okay.
I remember now. Thank you, Damon.
Sure. All right, so let's just get into the heart of the Gemara quickly. So all of these things are fairly, because you have to, and that was stated, by the way, Gavin, if you remember, in Shmuel chapter 21, verse 26 to 27. Okay, just so that you remember that. Okay.
I appreciate it. Can I just ask you one question before you move on? Just very quickly, if your ox gored that slave and it went right through his heart and he needs medical attention, surely he's your slave. You pay for it.
I have no idea. I'm assuming you do. Because if you kill your slave, you're liable to the death penalty. You're liable. It's like killing any other human being.
Absolutely. That makes sense.
Yeah. And why do you free your slave if you're damaged? Because he kind of went under your curatorship, because he was indentured to you, because he owed you money. Now that you basically owe him money, you set him free. What he owes you is offset by what you owe him. And even if you owe him a lot less than he owes you, if you can't treat him right, he goes free. If you kill him, you're liable to the death penalty. If you accidentally kill him, you're liable to the city of exile. This is a Jew killing his Jewish slave. Absolutely. And I have no reason to think that Gavin is incorrect. I think he is correct. You probably do pay for medical bills, etc., but you have to free your slave. All right, let's get to the heart of the Gemara. So the major issue we have is the second part. and this is with regards to wounding somebody or burning something on Shabbos. All right. So the Gemara is going to start. It rules. It basically starts a ruling which relates to our Mishnah concerning Shabbat. Rav Abai, who taught in a brisa before Rav Yochanan, all who do destructive acts on Shabbat are exempt from punishment, except one who inflicts a wound or one who burns something. Okay? So I want to explain to you what this actually means. Basically, if you have a look, if you have a look, there are two acts before we get into this Gemara where you don't have to pay. There's a law, Arthur, that we learned in Sanhedrin called Kimle B'dirama Minay, which means the lesser punishment is forgone when there's a greater punishment. So, for example, if you have a monetary compensation or a penalty at the same time where you're liable for the same act, and that person is liable to the death penalty, the lesser crime is waived. So, for example, if somebody is liable, if Rephael did two acts, one of idolatry and one of adultery, he's given the more severe death penalty because one can't kill him twice, and the more severe penalty covers both his transgressions. Kimle b'di rabba minay is when, for example, you do an act, say you're breaking Shabbos, but at the same time of breaking Shabbos, you cost somebody money. So, for example, you set alight the Picasso that's worth 20 million rand. The guy's going to cry bitter tears because he can't get the money back, because the person that burnt his Picasso on Shabbos is liable to the death penalty. So the lesser crime is waived in favor of the greater penalty. It's called Kimle B'di Rabba Minay. Okay? So what we're saying here is, while you're not liable to pay for wounding your parent or breaking the Shabbat, is because that person is going to lose their life. So therefore, they don't have to pay financial compensation. Okay? And what we say is, if your property injures one of your parents, or your property damages on Shabbat, you have to pay for the damage your property causes or the injury, because that animal is not going to be given the death penalty. So you have to make financial restitution. So it's on this basis that the Gemara is asking, hang on a second, all who do destructive acts on Shabbat are exempt from punishment, except for one who inflicts a wound and burns something. So basically, how do we know that Shabbat gets the death penalty? If you look at Shmuel, Exodus chapter 35, verse 2, and Numbers chapter 15, verse 15, it gives you the death penalties there for breaking Shabbat. So in general, if you look at the laws of Shabbat, only purposeful activity is forbidden biblically on the Shabbat. Because if you remember, there was a Hekesh, where what happens is it mentions the 39 activities in building the Mishkan. So Arthur, when you build the tabernacle, those are actual creative acts. And the next verse, which says there are activities that are prevented on Shabbos, we learn that from the 39 acts of creativity that is involved in building the tabernacle. So, for example, you're baking the loaves. You're harvesting and you're reaping the wheat in order to bake the bread. You're dyeing wool, etc., etc. These are all constructive, positive, creative acts. So that is what is biblically forbidden on Shabbat. If you're doing a destructive act with no purpose, there's no biblical prohibition, deraisa. There's a rabbinical prohibition, but not a biblical prohibition. Does that make sense? So what it's saying is, how is it possible necessarily? In other words, if you don't get the death penalty if you do a destructive act with no purpose, and that's if you do it intentionally with witnesses and warning and everything else. If you just do a destructive act and there's no purpose, You don't get a person doesn't get the death penalty. If you did it unintentionally, like say for example, what do we mean unintentionally? Either you weren't aware it was Shabbat, or you weren't aware that that act was prohibited on Shabbat, but it was a destructive act. Either way, you don't have to bring a chatas offering. Okay. So there was a question that was asked, and that question was asked. Rav Abayu taught in a brisa before Rav Yochanan, all who do destructive acts on the Shabbat are exempt from punishment, except for one who inflicts a wound and who burns something. Why can you do, what is the exception with the wound and one who burns something? So for example, because it's saying, if it's a destructive act, this is the essence of the argument. If it's a destructive act that wouldn't warrant the death penalty, in that particular case, you should have to pay your parents or pay if you burn something, because you don't get the death penalty if it's a destructive act for no purpose. And therefore, you don't lose your life, so you should pay. This is what Rav Abayu brought before Rav Yochanan with this brisa. That was the essence of it. Okay? And there's a slight difference here, because we found out that there are cases where you're allowed to, where it has a positive activity to wound on a Shabbos. Let me give you a perfect example. There had to be a specific biblical allowance, Kevin. There had to be a heter to allow a bris milah on Shabbat, circumcision on the Shabbos. There was a special dispensation where the Torah allowed it. And where's this? In Gemara Shabbos, Tractate 106a. Okay? So in Tractate Shabbat 106a. So this says that there was a specific decree allowing circumcision to be done on Shabbat. And therefore, what happens when you circumcise? You are wounding the genitalia of an 8-day-old baby. You're removing the foreskin. That is a wound. But it's a wound in order to do a mitzvah. Therefore, this is proof that a wound can be constructive. And therefore, if it can be constructive, and you, for whatever reason, then it means if you do, if a wound can be constructive, then that becomes a biblical prohibition. In other words, if I give you a special, what do you call it? A dispensation to say you can wound on a Shabbat only for a Brit Milah, it means that the default position is you're not allowed to wound on Shabbat. Therefore, it's seen as a constructive act. That's exactly the proof. In other words, if a wounding is just a destructive act, then there's no need to get a special dispensation that you can wound on Shabbat. But you have to hear, because this type of wounding has a possibility of a productive act of doing a mitzvah. So we have to discern between a productive act, such as a Brit Milah, or a destructive act when you generally just hurt for the sake of hurting and there's no purpose. So if it has a constructive act, if you wound, you could get the death penalty. So let me give you an example for a parent. Say a parent has an injury and you wound them on Shabbat by accident, but your purpose is to try and help them, like you lance a boil or whatever. In that case, you don't pay your parents because you get the death penalty for wounding your parents. So there's a difference between wounding and so that would have a double biblical prohibition. So in other words, one gets the death penalty if you hit your parents, but you also get a death penalty if you wound any Jew on Shabbat. Does that make sense? According to the one opinion, and according to another opinion, you don't get the death penalty because there's no constructive act to wound somebody. There's no positive act. Okay. In terms of burning, so there is a constructive act on burning. Why? There was a special dispensation that they could melt hot lead in order to kill a bas Kohen that had adultery. And since there was a special dispensation, it meant that you were not allowed to burn things on a Shabbat Because if you were allowed to, you wouldn't need a special dispensation. Am I making sense, guys? That's the essence of it. All right, so let me just give it to you off the top, and then this will make sense. So Rav Abayu taught in the Brisa before Rav Yochanan, all who do destructive acts on the Shabbat are exempt from punishment, except for one who wounds, inflicts a wound, and one who burns something. So Rav Yochanan objected to this teaching. He said to Rav Abayu, go out and teach your Brisa outside the study hall. What do you think he meant when he said teach your Brisa outside the study hall? Wasn't happy.
It's not right. Yeah,
no, he said it's not accurate. You need to teach it outside because I don't accept this. So what was his issue with it? Is that what Rav Yochanan is saying, all destructive acts are exempt from the death penalty done on Shabbat. It's rabbinically prohibited, but it's all exempt from the death penalty, even one who inflicts a wound or one who burns something. Okay? And Rav Abayu is saying, except for one who inflicts a wound or burns something. Why? Because for the general population, we don't do bris milah. The moihel does a bris milah. The moihel does it, a special, just like I'm not a shochet, I can't kill an animal. So a moihel would be able to give a bris milah, and I can't give the death penalty. The Sanhedrin would. So they have a dispensation. But the rest of us, wounding on a Shabbos or burning something has no positive act. And therefore, since it's destructive, it doesn't get the death penalty on Shabbos. That's what Rav Yochanan was implying. Okay? So the ruling that one inflicts a wound or burns something destructively on the Shabbos is liable to punishment is not a Tanaic teaching. For in fact, that person is not liable. And if you conclude and say that there's a Tanaic teaching that if one inflicts a wound or burns something, he is liable, the ruling concerning one who inflicts a wound must refer to the case where he needs the blood for his dog, and the ruling concerning one who burns something must refer to a case of where he needs its ashes. So what it's saying is this, is that if your animal destroys something by either creating a wound in somebody else or alternatively setting something alight, you have to pay. But the reason the person doesn't pay is they get the death penalty. And what it's saying is here is there's no bad death penalty to a person, so he has to pay. This is Rav Yochanan's argument to the Gemara. There's no death penalty, so he must pay. So what does this mean? It's saying that unless it can be proven that you did this act on Shabbos of burning or wounding for a constructive purpose, there's no death penalty. So what it's saying is, well, what possible reason could you need for blood? It says maybe where you need blood for his dog. I don't know what that means. But all the Gemara explaining it is saying that obviously it has a purpose why you need blood. So let me give you a perfect example. Say for medical reasons, you put leeches on yourself. They used to bleed people, remember, to lower their temperature. They didn't exactly have Discovery Health and Netcare. And then, for example, ashes. Why would you need ashes? Well, ashes help if you've got anemia or if you've got a wound or something and it relieves an itch, or it's taken with people with anemia to reduce the level of anemia, just as a matter of interest. So if there's a positive purpose, they don't pay for breaking the Shabbos because they get the death penalty. If there's no positive purpose, then they have to pay. So the Gemara challenges Rav Yochanan on the basis of comparison of the parallel teaching of our Mishnah. Okay? We learned in our Mishnah, if one's ox set fire to a stack on the Sabbath, but if he himself set fire to the stack on the Sabbath, he is not liable to pay because he's liable to lose his life. Now, by mentioning these two laws in one context, the Mishnah teaches that the case involving himself is similar to the case of his ox. We may therefore deduce that just as when one's ox sets fire to a stack on Shabbat, it does not need the ashes, so too, in a case where he himself sets fire to a stack on Shabbat, is one where he does not need the ashes. So what the Gemara is saying, look, an ox is stupid. An ox isn't intelligent. There's no ways that an ox would set fire to something in order to get the ashes. Therefore, a Gemara would never put together two things that have nothing to do with each other. So in other words, if your ox had no brains and set alight something, it means it had no use for the ashes, right? If a person had a use for the ashes, it would never bring this case where an ox had no use for the ashes, because there's no parallel concept derived from the one to the other. They're two different cases. So it's saying that here, this is proof that a person doesn't need the ashes. And since he doesn't need the ashes, and he's only destroying things with a fire, he doesn't get the death penalty. So why doesn't he pay? That's what it's saying. That's what Rav Yochanan's argument is. Okay? Yet the Mishnah teaches that he's not liable to pay because he's punished losing his life. Okay? The Gemara rejects this inference drawn in the Mishnah. No, this is not the meaning of the Mishnah. To the contrary, the Mishnah means that the case involving his ox is similar to the case involving himself, as follows. Just as in the case where he himself set fire to the stack on the Shabbat, in where he needs the ashes, for otherwise he is not liable to the death penalty, so to the case in which his ox set fire to the stack is one where it needs the ashes. So what it's trying to say in the Gemara is no. If you want to come to the conclusion and say, listen, the ox had no brains, it set fire to something, it had no purpose, the person had no brain, the person had no need for the ashes and just burned something because he didn't need the ashes for anything. It had no constructive purpose. Therefore, it was destructive. Therefore, he doesn't get the death penalty. The cases are not analogous. The Gemara says, no, you're not understanding. In this case, the ox was a very intelligent ox, and it decided to burn something to get the ashes. And therefore, it's mixing that with a case where somebody burned something for a purpose, and therefore, the reason he doesn't pay is he's liable to the death penalty. And the Gemara continues. The Gemara asks, concerning his ox, how did he find a case in which it needs the ashes? Rav Avia said to him, what are we dealing with here? We are dealing with an intelligent ox that suffered a bite in its back and wants to burn the stack and then roll in the ashes to relieve its pain. And how do we know it's that ox's intent? In other words, what it's saying is, all right, firstly, it's very unlikely that you've got an ox that can think about consequence. What's the proof of this? Because when most ox gores, let me give you a perfect example. An ox kills a person because it's irritated. Now that ox gets the death penalty. Has the ox ever thought of a consequence there? When a dog bites a person and gets the death penalty, do you think the dog has any awareness that it's going to get the lethal injection? No, it's brainless. It works on instinct. So therefore it's saying, have you ever seen such an ox? And how do you know the mind of an ox? How can you just say that ox was intelligent? So the Gemara answers, because we see that after it burns the stack, it rolls in the ashes. Meaning, we see that there's a sequence here. Ox sets something alight, lets the ashes cool, and rolls in it, and you can see a big bite on the ox's back, and it rolls in it to get relief, and you have to see it evidentially. So the Gemara says, come on, is there ever such a case? The Gemara says, yes. For once there was a certain ox in Rav Papa's house that had a toothache. It went inside, pushed the cover off a beer barrel, drank the beer, and was healed. So it says, yes, listen, we've seen a case of animal intelligence in Rav Papa's house. It suffered from a toothache. It went to the beer barrel, took off the lid, and drank until it was half unconscious and were healed as a result. And it took away the pain. So we say, okay, so there is an example. But the Gemara still notes a difficulty with the Mishnah. Why? The rabbi said before Rav Papa, can you say that the Mishnah means that the case involving his ox is similar to the case involving himself? It says, because the Mishnah teaches in its first clause, if one's ox humiliated someone, he is not liable. But if he himself humiliated someone, he is liable. For if the case involving his ox is similar to the case involving himself, okay, it must be one in which the ox intended to humiliate the victim. How can you ever find such a case? An ox certainly lacks the intelligence to intentionally humiliate someone. So remember, we learned in this mission, it says, if your ox humiliates somebody, you don't have to pay. But if you as a person humiliate somebody, you do have to pay. So this now is being used against that sort of presupposition and saying, listen, what do you mean an ox is intelligent? We just learned that an ox, if it humiliates, it doesn't have to pay. And if an ox is intelligent, it meant it had intention to humiliate. And since it was smart enough to have the intelligence to humiliate, why don't we make the owner of the ox pay? So this is proof that the animal is dumb. Why? Because it doesn't have intent to humiliate. And a person does, therefore a person pays. Okay? So that was the counter-refutation. So the Gemara answers, it is in the case where the ox intended to injure the victim, and that is similar to a case concerning himself. For the master said in a brisa, as long as one intended to injure, he is liable for humiliation, even though he did not intend to humiliate. Okay? So we learned this, if you remember, in 27a, in Bava Kamma, that if a person falls off a roof, and halfway off falling off a roof, Kevin, he tries to gain his composure and he wants to land on somebody else, so he injures himself on the least. Now, the fact that he gathered his composure, he didn't want to humiliate the other person, but he really didn't mind injuring them in order to protect himself. Or a case in a bar fight. Maybe he didn't mean to. In a bar fight is the only time you want to humiliate somebody because you want to hurt them in front of other people. So there you pay for humiliation stun because there you're trying to humiliate. Okay? But if your intent was to hit, not in front of witnesses, that is still humiliating because your intention was to hurt. And therefore, based on the intent of wanting to hurt, you pay. Does that make sense? But there's one problem I personally have with this part of the Gemara, which I don't know, which I'll share with you. Okay. It says, look here, guys. It says if one's ox humiliated somebody, is not liable, but if he himself humiliated somebody, he is liable. My problem that I have with this is if you're saying that the ox intending to injure is the reason why somebody is considered you paid for humiliation if your intention is to injure, right? So my view is that if an ox gores, its intent is to hurt somebody else. So why wouldn't you pay for humiliation if humiliation is deemed as intent to injure? Does that make sense? Why wouldn't you pay for your ox humiliating? And the only answer I can think of is because when a human being intends to injure, a human being is responsible for their actions because they are know that Hashem does not allow such a thing, and they have intelligence, whereas an animal works on instinct. So this is my only part that I don't understand, why the Gemara would say that an ox would perhaps be intelligent in the case to create a fire, to have ashes, to recover a wound. Does that make sense? That's the only thing that doesn't make sense, because an animal works on instinct. So the one opinion is it's actually making an analogy between a case where an ox intended to do an act of burning something on Shabbat in order to do a constructive act, in order to alleviate an itch with the ashes, and that's why it's comparing it to a human being that does the same constructive act, and since it is a constructive act on Shabbos, he doesn't pay because he's liable to the death penalty. But if it was a destructive act, he wouldn't be liable to pay. So it's saying, the Gemara is saying, this is an ox that had intelligence, and so too had a purpose in burning, and so too here the person has a purpose in burning. But because it's not very likely that that happens, there is a differing opinion, which we will learn, which means that it's not necessarily the case. In other words, having concluded its discussion of the first resolution of the challenge to Rav Yochanan from our Mishnah, the Gemara offers another resolution. This is more my favorite. This resolution accepts the premise that the Mishnah means that the case involving the person himself burning a stack on Shabbat is similar to the case involving his ox, and in the case where he does not need the ashes. Nevertheless, when the Mishnah exempts him from paying, it does not contradict Rav Yochanan's opinion that he is not liable to death penalty for desecrating the Shabbos. So the second resolution that's going to be undertaken now is much more plausible. What it's saying is this animal's as dumb as anything. It had no sequential planning, no understanding. It worked on instinct, and it did a destructive act for no purpose. And therefore, a human being does a destructive act for no purpose. So we're saying, well, then what's this Mishnah all about to say that he doesn't pay because you get the death penalty? We just learned that you don't get the death penalty if there's a destructive act for no purpose. And why does it go along with a case of why does it go along with a case where it doesn't contradict Rav Yochanan? Because Rav Yochanan's opinion, again, is that any destructive act with no purpose doesn't get the death penalty. So how does the Mishnah say there's a death penalty? And the resolution, which we'll tackle next time, is basically saying, look, at the end of the day, if you're subject to the death penalty, but you don't get the death penalty, that's enough to get you off the financial hook with Kim Leibadi Rabba Minne. Let me give you an example. Say you burn somebody's Picasso and you didn't get warning. You're not going to get the death penalty. If there's only one witness, you're not going to get the death. But because the potential for the act of breaking Shabbat because you could lose your life if you did it either constructively, in other words, given there's a purpose, or there was the right amount of witnesses, or a warning, etc. Under the right circumstance, that person would get the death penalty or go to the city of exile. Either way, because that potential in ideal circumstances is there, that already triggers Kim Leibadi Rabba Minne, which means he's off the hook financially. Let me give you a proof. In Sanhedrin, we say there's a thief that breaks into a house, and the owner could kill him if he finds this person in his house. So Kim Leibadi Rabba Minne means because his life is in danger for breaking in, he's not liable if he breaks the barrel of the homeowner. Now, will the homeowner kill him? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the homeowner won't even wake up. Maybe the homeowner will shout at him. But because he has the potential to lose his life, he's not liable for any damage that he causes while his life is at stake. He's liable for theft because when he gets back with a stolen item, he has to make restitution, but not for damage done simultaneously while his life is at risk. And that's the law by Kim Leibadi Rabba Minne. Meaning, even if there's no positive act and destructive act, it's only a destructive. If it was a positive act, he'd get the death penalty with the right witnesses, with warnings, etc. So if any of the factors are missing, like witnesses or warnings or the constructive nature of the act, he's still, although he wouldn't get the death penalty, he's still protected under Kim Leibadi Rabba Minne, because if those criteria were fulfilled for breaking Shabbat, one would get the death penalty. So the second plausible answer is saying it doesn't criticize Rav Yochanan. It's saying, yes, you don't get the death penalty for a destructive act, but had it been positive or had there been a purpose, he would. And therefore, he doesn't pay. It just happens there weren't enough witnesses, warnings, or a positive act that could be seen. But he would get the death penalty. Therefore, he doesn't pay if the act is done simultaneously. And that's all I wanted to say about that. I wish you a good Shabbos, guys.